The original vision of the Phillips curve had a stable long-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation. But this view fell apart in the 1970s as we saw both high inflation and high unemployment, or stagflation. The early Phillips curve view was fallacious because it ignored the role of expectations. Expectations would become a key concept in macroeconomics as a result. To see how expectations work through the system, we will bring back the importance of the short-run aggregate supply curve and the related role of price adjustments. We can jump back to our previous example right where we left off of the Phillips curve. You could imagine a situation where the natural rate of unemployment is, say, 5%, and you have the original vision of the Phillips curve where you think that there is a stable trade-off between higher inflation and lower unemployment. If you try to lower your unemployment along this Phillips curve menu, what you could do is you could say, let's have 4% unemployment. But in order to do that, you would have to be willing to take on pi 2 level of inflation. But once we do this, eventually people come to expect the pi 2 level of inflation. They build it into their decision-making process. They know that higher levels of inflation are likely to happen. Consider wages as a representation of resource prices. If you know that inflation of 10% is going to happen next year, so let's say it's 2050 and your wage is $100, and you know that 10% inflation is going to happen, what is your reservation wage going to be? Well, for next year, if you're only willing to work this year for 100, then next year, you better have this knowledge that, hey, there's going to be 10% inflation. I should be at minimum, my reservation wage should be $110, right? If I know I'm going to be paid at next year's price level, I'm going to ask for that inflation to be baked into what I'm asking for. You know the inflation is coming. And so do the decision makers, quite frankly, on the other side of the negotiation, right? Supply and demand just adjust to the inflation. And while our prices go up, if we know it's coming, nothing really changes to the underlying factors of supply and demand. Markets will clear. So we can think of the original move where money has been injected into the economy, causing an increase in aggregate demand, as one time period. And then in the next time period, we come to expect this level of inflation. When we come to expect that level of inflation and a higher price level, resource prices will rise. Rising resource prices shifts back our short-run aggregate supply curve. This is really kind of our second time period that we have here, right? So stage one, we got pushed out. We lowered unemployment to say 4%, and the price level jumped from price level 1 up to price level 2. But then during the second time period, what happens is we adjust to this higher price level. We adjust to the fact that there's going to be inflation. And in time period 2, we adjust to this level of inflation, and that means that our resource prices adjust to it, and that's why our short-run aggregate supply curve shifts back, and we get price level 3 created. Right? So now we've adjusted to this level of inflation and we're back to our full employment level of output. We're no longer at this lower unemployment level of just 4%. In order to represent this situation with our new level of expectations about inflation, we'll have to draw a new Phillips curve. Here we can say that at time period 0, we are at the purple dot. And then one time period passes and we move up to the gray or silver dot. And then another time period happens once we have adjusted to that inflation taking place, and we move to the green dot, right? We have this new level of expectations about inflation, and what that means on our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph is that we're moving up in price levels, but we're eventually just kind of shifting back to the full employment level of unemployment. With a Phillips curve, that doesn't work. We see that we have to draw an entirely new Phillips curve. We have to shift things out because we now have a higher level of inflation, but we also have the same level that we started with in terms of unemployment. Note that the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model makes it look like inflation should be even higher, Price level 3 is, after all, higher than price level 2. But that is because the Phillips curve is looking at the inflation rate. Say 10% is pi 2. Whereas the aggregate supply aggregate demand model is showing the price level. And we can think of two time periods as having elapsed within the model that we showed here. First, the one where we are fooled and the price level jumps from price level 1 up to price level 2. And then the next where we adjust. So from price level 2 to price level 3. So if there is a 10% inflation rate, well, during two time periods, the price level would jump twice then. So we could think of the price level 1 as being 100. And then during that first time period, the price level goes up to 110. That would be our price level 2. And then at our second stage, or our second action here, our second move in the sequence, our second time period, we go from the gray to the green. But this could be represented as, again, just 10% inflation. We've now come to expect 10% inflation, but now it's year 2. And so the price level goes, say, from 110 up to 121. So it's still at the same inflation rate, pi 2, but we have a higher price level because two time periods have occurred. This form of expectations that we show on this mapping of both of these graphs is people looking at the previous time period and then adjusting their expectations to be equal to the previous time period's inflation. So we move aggregate demand out by inflating, and we have, say, 10% inflation. Then we come to expect the 10% inflation in the next time period, and we adjust to that, which brings us back to our natural rate of unemployment and at that new level of inflation. Once we reach the second time period, people expect a level of inflation of, say, pi 2, as we showcase in the Phillips curve here, and therefore we have to move to this new Phillips curve, PC2. Unemployment is back to the 5% level, and we have this higher level of the inflation rate. If policymakers continue to try to achieve an unemployment rate of 4% instead of 5%, well, they would have to raise inflation again, say to pi 3. So we would have to go even above 10% inflation in this case. By raising inflation, the unemployment rate will drop as we move to the left along the Phillips curve 2. But eventually, people are going to start expecting this higher level of inflation, pi 3. And a new Phillips curve is again needed, PC3 here. Every time our expectations adjust to the level of inflation, we need a new Phillips curve. Because what is happening is the short-run aggregate supply curve is shifting back once we expect this higher level of inflation. We are no longer being fooled by the monetary policy to have the aggregate demand cross the short-run aggregate supply curve at a point beyond full employment. When we're there, resource prices are driven up as we start to incorporate the higher inflation into our understanding of what's happening. The short-run aggregate supply curve pushes back, and that gets us back to our normal, natural level of unemployment. And if we're at that natural level of unemployment, but we still have this higher inflation, we need a new Phillips curve. The Phillips curve has to shift out. What we see is a sort of zigzagging of the economy as individuals are fooled by inflation, and then expectations are updated and the economy resorts back to the original level of unemployment. This depiction of the Phillips curve would feature what is called adaptive expectations, that our expectations adapt to what has happened in the past. That level of unemployment the economy keeps getting back to is the natural rate of unemployment, or as is called in more advanced models, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or the NAIRU. Modern models of the Phillips curve will often have this line demarking the natural rate of unemployment as the natural rate of unemployment or the long-run Phillips curve. That zigzagging that we see is very much so representative of adaptive expectations. People expecting the inflation rate that existed in the previous time period once we hit that new time period. With an understanding of adaptive expectations, We know that inflation can only reduce unemployment in the short run. And this was Friedman's view. The Phillips curve only works when people are fooled by inflation. They suffer money illusion. Adaptive expectations only allows for people to be fooled for one time period. So there is only a short-run solution to unemployment, and long-run problems of high inflation can occur if the short-run solution is used too often. So with adaptive expectations, there is a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment, but it's not stable. It's not a long-run trade-off. However, this is only one theory of expectations to come out of this discussion. In fact, it is not even the prominent theory of expectations for modern mainstream macro. There are two theories of how expectations are formed that we want to focus on here. First is what we've covered, adaptive expectations, where individuals form their expectations about the future on the basis of data from the recent past. But then there is also rational expectations, which assumes that people use all pertinent information, not just what happened in the last time period, right? They use all pertinent information, including data on the conduct of current policymakers in forming their expectations about what will happen in the future. According to adaptive expectations hypothesis, what actually occurs during the most recent time period or set of periods determines the individual's future expectations. So the expected future rate of inflation lags behind the actual rate by one time period. And so we can see this in this graph here. What happens is that on the top graph, what we're showing is the actual rate of inflation. In the bottom graph, we're showing the expected rate of inflation. So in the top graph, what happens in time period 1 is we have a certain level of inflation, right? And that becomes what is expected in time period 2, right? So once we're in time period 2, what is our expectation? Well, our expectation is, well, what happened last time? What actually happened? Right? And then we can trace this on through, and we can see this through the rest of the graph. Whatever happened actually on the top graph is what becomes expected in the next round of behavior or the next time period in all actuality. So we can see that in the bottom graph. We can contrast this with rational expectations theory. Under rational expectations, rather than simply assuming the future will be like our immediate past, people also consider the expected effects of changes in policy. Policy changes cause people to alter their expectations about the future. There's all kinds of information out there that people could use to kind of predict or think about what they expect to be the policy at hand. With rational expectations, the forecasts of individuals will not always be correct, but people will not continue to make the same type of errors. The errors of rational decision makers will be random. The errors, in other words, will not exhibit a systematic pattern that could be taken advantage of. Oh, we're always one time period behind like we are in adaptive expectations. That's not going to happen. Some people will guess way too high, so they will predict what kind of inflation we'll have and they'll guess too high. Some people will guess way too low, but on average, we will guess things correctly. That's what kind of the essence of rational expectations. There's a distribution about our guesses or our expectations, what they will be, but the average, the mean, is basically correct. So you can think about an example of rational expectations as it applies to a different situation. You can think about it as students' expectations about the benefit of going to class, the benefit versus the cost of going to class. So a student is in college and thinking about, should I skip class today? Well, how much is it really going to benefit me towards, future tests or whatever? And how much does it kind of cost? How boring is the lecture going to be? How long is it going to last? All of these kind of things. If the student is consistently fooled and the class is less beneficial than they expected, then they're the morons, not the professor. They should be updating their expectations to get them correct and decide, maybe I should just skip class then, or maybe they shouldn't. But you shouldn't consistently be fooled about how beneficial that class would be. On average, you should guess about correct. We could show this with our graph similar to what happened with adaptive expectations, but now there's no longer just looking to historical data. We're guessing, but we're guessing on average correctly. So if we look at the graph, the expected future rate of inflation is the actual rate of inflation. So in this case, it's a little bit different. What we expect to happen in time period 1 is what the actual rate of inflation is in time period 1. Right? So the expected graph again is on the bottom and the actual rate is on the top. And in this case, with rational expectations, we can see that these align. There are major differences between these two theories of expectations. If adaptive expectations theory is correct, people adjust at least a little bit more slowly. Systematic errors will occur under adaptive expectations, but they will not occur under rational expectations. So for example, when the inflation rate is rising, decision makers will systematically tend to underestimate the future rate of inflation under adaptive expectations. If we keep increasing the inflation rate, it was 1%, now 2%, now 3%, now 4%. Decision makers under adaptive expectations will always be a little bit behind. They'll always be lagging a little bit behind and underestimating the future rate of inflation. But this will not happen under rational expectations. Under adaptive expectations, people still suffer from money illusion. They think things like higher wage offers are just better offers, where in reality, they are the same offer, but just with inflation. The nominal wage has risen, but the real wage has not. But people only suffer from money illusion with adaptive expectations for one time period. Under rational expectations theory, people do not suffer from money illusion at all. They may over or underestimate the current period's inflation rate, but on average, they are correct with their estimation. What happens to our Phillips curve when we not only build in expectations, but build in now kind of this stronger version of expectations, rational expectations? We can look at the Phillips curve with rational expectations and kind of go back to our original example where we have this 5% unemployment as our natural rate of unemployment, and we're at our starting point, kind of time period 0, our level of inflation is that pi 1. And we can say, okay, well, let's again aim to reduce unemployment down to say 4% by having some inflation. Well, what happens? A new Phillips curve is instantly created because our expectations are going to be correct that we're going to have some inflation. We can see that policymakers are starting to talk about this, starting to think about it, and so we already adjust. The short-run aggregate supply curve moves back into the left at the same time that the aggregate demand curve moves out, and all we end up with is higher rate of inflation, and our unemployment level doesn't move from that 5%. The only change is in the level of inflation. We could try this again and say, oh, well, wait, we didn't fool them that time. Let's fool them again, a new time. Let's try and really get that unemployment level down. What happens when we try and inflate beyond pi 2 or above pi 2? Well, we end up with just pi 3, but we don't reduce the unemployment level. We just kind of climb the ladder and create these new Phillips curves. We're trying inflating again and again, but people on average are estimating the level of inflation correctly, which creates this new Phillips curve for us. They aren't suffering from money illusion, and instead of lowering the level of unemployment through inflation, the level of unemployment remains the same, and inflation just jumps. With adaptive expectations, an unanticipated shift to a more expansionary policy will temporarily stimulate output and employment. But with rational expectations, decision makers do not make systematic errors, and therefore the impact of expansionary policies is unpredictable. But there's no short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. There's not even a short-run Phillips curve here, really. It's only the long-run Phillips curve. But what we see with either theory of expectations, adaptive or rational, is that sustained expansionary policies will lead to inflation without permanently increasing output nor reducing unemployment. We don't have a simple menu trade-off of a Phillips curve. We don't have just one Phillips curve. Once we have expectations built in, that's showcasing that people will adjust their expectations, that Resource prices will have to kind of adapt because people now are no longer going to be fooled. They're no longer going to have money illusion. They're not going to be fooled by expansionary monetary policy. And so resource prices are going to adjust. Resource prices are going to rise if we're inflating the money supply. And when resource prices rise, like wages, what happens is that short-run aggregate supply curve shifts back, and we end up back at our natural rate of unemployment. But we have higher inflation. The only way to model that in the Phillips curve world is to create an entirely new Phillips curve. We do not have just one Phillips curve once you put in expectations to our model. Either adaptive or rational, when we have expectations augmenting our Phillips curve, we have to realize that there is not just one Phillips curve, but many Phillips curves that exist. And that this long-run Phillips curve is going to be an important concept to understand that we can't just focus on the short run, that we can't just make the trade-off along one Phillips curve. Expectations completely change the way that we think about monetary policy from our experience in the 1970s, where we had stagflation, to our policies that followed thereafter in the 1980s and 1990s. Expectations become an entirely important element of macroeconomics. Click on the video to see the conclusion to the Phillips curve and the end of the Keynesian consensus.